In a quiet lakeside town in Montana, a ruthless land enforcer slapped an elderly widow in the middle of Cedar Grove Diner while everyone watched in silence. No one moved. Fear had trained the whole town to look away. The man laughed, believing money and power already owned this place. What he didn't know was that the woman wasn't alone. At that very moment, the diner door was about to open. Her son, a Navy SEAL, and his loyal Belgian Malinois K9 were walking in. One cruel slap was about to expose corruption around Cedar Lake and awaken the courage of an entire town. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if stories of courage and justice move you, please subscribe for more. Cedar Grove. Montana woke slowly under a pale winter morning that carried the quiet weight of a town built beside deep water and older forests. The kind of place where pine trees climbed the surrounding hills like silent sentries, and the lake stretched wide and cold beneath a sky the color of worn steel, its surface chopped by wind drifting down from the mountains. And along Main Street the buildings stood low and practical: hardware store, bait shop, gas station, diner. Each structure holding decades of repairs, faded paint, and stories that rarely traveled far beyond the county line, while pickup trucks sat frosted along the curb, and the air carried a mix of wood smoke, diesel, and lake water, a smell familiar enough to feel like the town itself. Breathing, steady and restrained, because Cedar Grove had learned over the years that surviving was less about progress and more about endurance, and that endurance had slowly shaped the people who lived here into quiet observers of trouble rather than challengers of it. Helen Carter stepped into that morning with the careful dignity of someone who had lived long enough to recognize how fragile peace could be and had decided long ago that dignity was something no one else should be allowed to take from her. And at 78 she was small and composed, her silver hair gathered neatly into a low twist behind her head, her skin pale and thin with the fine lines carved by years of lake wind and long winters. And though grief had settled into her life after the death of her husband Frank Carter nearly a decade earlier, it had never bent her posture or dimmed the calm clarity in her blue eyes, because Helen belonged to a generation that carried sorrow quietly and continued moving forward without announcing it. And the faded green cardigan she wore that morning hung lightly over a pressed blouse, while sensible shoes tapped softly along the sidewalk as she approached the familiar red-trimmed building of Cedar Grove Diner, a place she had visited for years, not because it was remarkable, but because it was dependable, and dependable things in small towns often became anchors for people who had lost too much to risk drifting. Inside Cedar Grove Diner, the warmth wrapped around her like a memory that had been reheated many times, but never entirely lost its comfort, the smell of frying bacon and old coffee lingering in the air while the grill hissed steadily behind the counter, and sunlight filtered through slightly fogged windows, falling across the black and white tile floor that had been worn dull by decades of boots and morning routines. And behind the counter stood Emily Harper, 26 years old and already carrying the quiet exhaustion of someone who had learned responsibility earlier than expected. Her auburn hair tied back loosely, freckles scattered across a pale face that might have looked carefree in another life, but now carried a thoughtful caution in her hazel eyes. Because Emily had grown up in Cedar Grove, dreaming of leaving until her father's stroke anchored her here, and the diner job became the practical solution to family bills and younger siblings who still needed support. And somewhere along that path, she had also learned that certain men in town did not like witnesses to their behavior, especially after the mayor himself had once leaned casually across this same counter to remind her that new investors were bringing opportunity to Cedar Grove, and that opportunity should not be complicated by unnecessary complaints. Helen slid into the booth beside the window where she always sat, folding her gloves neatly beside her plate as Emily poured coffee into the familiar chipped mug without needing to ask what she wanted, because routine had already answered that question years ago. And for a moment the diner returned to its quiet rhythm as Helen wrapped her hands around the warm mug and looked out through the glass toward the faint glimmer of the lake beyond the buildings, thinking briefly of the small piece of shoreline land she still owned there. The land her husband had bought when Cedar Grove was still only a fishing stop and a lumber road, the land that now carried value far beyond anything Frank Carter had imagined when he built their modest house overlooking the water. Because recently, that same, Land had drawn attention from developers who spoke of resorts and lakefront views, while Helen continued to see only the memory of her husband repairing the dock and her son learning to fish in the early morning light. The bell above the diner door rang sharply then, cutting through the low conversation and the soft scrape of cutlery in a way that caused several heads to lift at once, and Logan Briggs stepped inside with the heavy confidence of a man who had learned that intimidation could travel ahead of him like a shadow, his broad frame filling the doorway for a moment before he shut out the cold wind behind him. And Logan was the kind of man Cedar Grove had slowly grown used to over the past year. Early 40s, thick through the shoulders and chest, with the heavy build of someone who relied on size more than discipline. Dark hair slicked back loosely, stubble darkening his jaw, while his small eyes carried the restless alertness of someone always searching for weakness in a room, and though he officially worked security for the Caldwell Development Group, everyone in town understood his real task was persuading reluctant landowners to reconsider their decisions. Persuasion that rarely involved patience and often relied on public humiliation or carefully delivered threats that left no marks but always left a message. Logan spotted Helen almost immediately and crossed the diner floor with deliberate steps that seemed louder than they needed to be, stopping beside her booth while several customers lowered their eyes to their plates with the practiced avoidance that had become instinct in Cedar Grove, because the town had already seen enough confrontations to know that Logan Briggs did not come into the diner for breakfast, and his shadow fell across Helen's table as he leaned slightly forward with one hand resting against the booth, his voice carrying easily through the room when he asked whether she had reconsidered the offer for her lake property. And Helen looked up slowly, meeting his gaze with the calm steadiness of someone who understood that surrender would not buy respect, and fear would not buy peace, and her answer was quiet but unmistakable as she told him that the house was not for sale and never would be. For a moment, Logan's smile held, thin and theatrical, but the patience behind it collapsed quickly into irritation as he straightened and glanced around the diner as if inviting the room to witness what happened when people refused reasonable offers. And the silence that followed was thick enough to feel deliberate, because every person present knew that Caldwell's resort project had already absorbed several properties around the lake, each one acquired after a similar conversation that had ended badly for someone. And Emily stood frozen behind the counter with the coffee pot still in her hand, while Helen remained seated in the booth, shoulders square, despite the tension building in the room. And when Logan finally spoke again, his tone had shifted from persuasion to contempt, telling her that Cedar Grove was changing whether she liked it or not. The slap came suddenly, the sharp crack of Logan's hand striking Helen's face, echoing against the diner walls with a brutality that seemed almost louder than the storm wind outside, and Helen's head turned with the force of it, while the coffee in her mug trembled and spilled across the table, a red mark blooming across her pale cheek as shock rippled through the room. Yet no one moved, because fear had already taught Cedar Grove how to stay still when power chose violence. And Emily gasped softly behind the counter, her knuckles tightening around the coffee pot, as anger rose against the memory of that quiet warning from the mayor months earlier. The warning that trouble with Caldwell's investors would bring consequences the diner could not afford. The front door opened again then, the bell ringing once more with an ordinary sound that somehow seemed to steady the entire room. And a man stepped inside wearing the unmistakable presence of someone shaped by discipline rather than comfort, 34 years old, tall and lean-muscled, with the controlled posture of a trained operator, his sandy blonde hair cut short in a strict military crop, while a neatly trimmed beard framed a rugged jaw, and hazel eyes swept the diner in a single measured glance that absorbed every detail without haste. And he wore the green digital camouflage of Navy working uniform, Type 3 AOR2, blouse and trousers, clean and precise without name tape or rank. The uniform sitting naturally on a body that carried years of training and deployment in its quiet strength, and beside him moved a Belgian Malinois named Rex, 5 years old, fawn-colored with a dark mask across the muzzle, powerful but lean with muscles visible beneath his coat, amber eyes sharp and focused, while a matte black tactical harness wrapped snugly around his chest, the dog moving without tension on the leash, yet radiating the calm readiness of a K9 trained to react instantly when commanded. and the moment the man's gaze settled on Helen Carter, standing beside the booth with the mark of Logan Briggs's hand still rising across her cheek, the entire room seemed to understand what Logan had not yet realized, that the man now standing inside Cedar Grove Diner was Ethan Carter, and the quiet morning in Cedar Grove had just changed. The silence inside Cedar Grove Diner did not break immediately after Ethan Carter stepped through the door. It tightened instead, like a rope pulled slowly through gloved hands, because every person in the room could feel the change in gravity without anyone announcing it aloud. And Ethan himself did not rush forward or raise his voice or show any visible anger, even though the red mark on Helen Carter's cheek had already hardened into something unmistakable. Because men shaped by years inside the teams learned early that anger was noise while control was power. And so he moved across the diner floor with the deliberate pace of someone who understood distance, angles, and consequence. The green digital camouflage of his Navy working uniform, Type 3 AOR2, catching faint light from the windows while the room watched him approach the booth where Logan Briggs still stood broad and arrogant beside Helen. And beside Ethan moved Rex, the 5-year-old Belgian Malinois, whose presence carried a quiet intensity sharpened by discipline. His fawn coat tight across a muscular frame, built for speed and endurance, dark mask across his muzzle, amber eyes focused forward while the matte black tactical harness hugged his chest with functional precision. And though the dog made no sound, his ears were upright and his posture slightly forward, the stance of a trained canine reading the body language of the man beside him rather than the chaos of the room. Logan Briggs turned halfway as Ethan approached, and for a brief second the large man's confidence hesitated, not because he recognized Ethan, but because instinct sometimes detected danger before pride allowed acknowledgement, and Logan's thick shoulders squared while his jaw tightened as he studied the newcomer, seeing the uniform first, then the posture, then the dog, yet still choosing the reckless path common to men who had spent too long winning fights that required little courage, and Ethan stopped directly beside his mother without touching Logan at all, placing himself between them with a subtle shift of position that claimed the space more effectively than a shove ever could, his hazel eyes resting first on Helen while his voice arrived low and steady, the tone calm enough to quiet the trembling in her hands when he asked simply whether she was hurt. And Helen, though shaken, lifted her chin slightly in the same stubborn dignity she had carried all morning, and told him she would be fine, because mothers often tried to protect their sons even when the danger stood directly in front of them. Rex settled into a sit at Ethan's left side without being commanded, the motion smooth and precise as if gravity itself had placed him there, and his gaze locked immediately onto Logan Briggs with a stillness that made the air feel heavier, because Rex was not merely a dog reacting to tension, but a working K9 trained to observe micro-movements in shoulders and hands, a dog who had spent years learning when to remain invisible and when to become a weapon. And Logan noticed the animal then, really noticed him for the first time, the dark mask, the unwavering stare, the muscles held tight beneath the harness. And though Logan laughed, the sound carried a faint edge now as he stepped backward half a pace and muttered something about strangers interfering in local business, but Ethan did not answer with threats or insults. He only met Logan's eyes for a long second before saying quietly that the conversation was finished and Logan needed to step away. The bell above the diner door rang again before Logan could decide how to respond, and Sheriff Daniel Brooks entered with the unhurried walk of a man who had learned to carry authority in his shoulders rather than in his voice, though years behind a desk had softened the strength he might once have had, and Brooks was in his late 50s with sandy hair thinning along the temples and a thick gray mustache trimmed neatly across a face that would have looked trustworthy in another life. Tall but slightly stooped, as if the weight of compromise had settled permanently into his posture, his uniform pressed but worn at the elbows, the polished badge on his chest catching the diner light as he stepped inside and scanned the room with tired blue eyes that had witnessed too many small-town conflicts and resolved too few of them honestly, because Sheriff Brooks had begun his career decades earlier as an earnest deputy who believed the law protected communities. Yet somewhere between budget cuts, political pressure, and the arrival of Caldwell's development money, he had discovered how easy it was to redefine peace as silence. "What's going on here?" Brooks asked, the question delivered in a tone that suggested inconvenience rather than urgency. And Logan spoke quickly before anyone else could answer, shrugging as if the entire incident had been nothing more than a misunderstanding, while Emily Harper finally found the courage to step out from behind the counter, her voice tight but determined as she told the sheriff that Logan had struck Helen Carter in front of everyone. Yet Brooks only nodded slowly as if weighing whether the truth was useful to him at that moment, his gaze moving briefly to Helen's cheek before shifting away again toward Logan. And when he spoke, his words carried the careful neutrality of someone who preferred not to choose sides where money might be involved, suggesting that tempers sometimes got out of hand and that everyone should calm down before things became more complicated than necessary. Ethan listened without interruption, standing motionless beside his mother, while Rex remained seated like a carved statue of quiet threat. And though Ethan's expression did not change, the room could sense the calculation moving behind his eyes as he measured not only Logan Briggs, but also Sheriff Brooks and the silent witnesses scattered through the diner booths, because none of this behavior was unfamiliar to someone who had operated in places where authority could bend under pressure. And finally Ethan simply nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that the moment had revealed enough truth for now. And he helped Helen gather her gloves before guiding her gently toward the door, while Logan watched with a crooked smirk that tried to disguise the discomfort Rex's gaze still created. Outside, the cold wind off Cedar Lake struck them immediately, carrying the scent of pine and water as Ethan opened the passenger door of his old pickup truck and helped Helen inside with the same quiet care he might have used assisting an injured teammate. And Rex leaped easily into the truck bed, where a weathered blanket lay folded against the metal, settling there with his head up and ears alert, while Ethan circled the truck and slid behind the wheel. And the drive toward the lake unfolded in silence, except for the steady rumble of the engine and the distant call of gulls drifting over the water. Because Cedar Grove looked different now through Ethan's eyes, the streets smaller than memory, yet heavier with tension, the storefronts worn but watchful, and when the road curved toward the shoreline their house appeared ahead, a modest cedar structure perched slightly above the lake, with a narrow wooden dock stretching into the gray water below. The same house Frank Carter had built with his own hands decades earlier. Helen moved slowly inside, while Ethan checked the porch and the yard with the automatic habit of someone trained to confirm safety rather than assume it. And Rex followed close behind with his nose lowered briefly to the ground before stepping onto the porch beside him, the dog's tail still while his ears tracked distant sounds along the tree line. And inside the house, the air carried the familiar smell of cedar boards and old photographs that lined the hallway walls, reminders of a life that had once been quieter than this. And Ethan helped his mother sit at the kitchen table where morning light filtered through the windows overlooking the lake, the calm surface outside hiding the tension already building beneath the day. Night arrived colder than expected, the wind sharpening against the lake and rattling lightly against the windows of the Carter house. And Ethan had just finished securing the back door when the power flickered once and died completely, plunging the house into a heavy darkness broken only by the faint glow of moonlight through the trees. And Rex rose instantly from where he had been lying near the kitchen doorway, his body stiffening as his head turned toward the front yard, ears forward while a low vibration moved through his chest. Not quite a growl, but the warning before one, and then a sharp crack shattered the quiet as a stone struck the living room window, glass splintering across the floor, while another rock bounced off the porch railing outside, the message delivered clearly. Enough without words. Across town, the lights of Cedar Grove Diner had dimmed for the evening when Emily Harper stepped outside into the cold, pulling her jacket tighter as she walked down the street toward the small newspaper office on Pine Avenue, where Jack Turner worked late most nights, and Jack Turner was the kind of journalist small towns rarely appreciated until trouble finally surfaced. 32 years old, with dark hair always slightly disheveled, thin framed glasses perched on a narrow nose, and the restless energy of someone who believed unanswered questions deserved pursuit. His office cluttered with stacks of documents and maps pinned to the wall marking property lines around Cedar Lake. And when Emily told him what had happened in the diner that morning, he listened carefully, his expression sharpening with interest because for months he had been tracing suspicious land purchases tied to Caldwell Development. And as Emily described, Logan Briggs and the pressure on Helen Carter, both of them began to suspect that the slap in the diner had not been an isolated act of cruelty, but the visible edge of something larger moving quietly beneath Cedar Grove. Morning returned to Cedar Grove with the gray patience of early spring along Cedar Lake, the wind softer than the night before, but still cold enough to keep mist clinging low across the water, while the pine ridges above town caught the first pale sunlight. And from the narrow road that curved along the shoreline, the Carter house looked quiet again, its cedar boards dark with dew, and its dock stretching into the lake, like a thin finger pointing toward open water. Yet the broken glass from the night before had already been swept away, and the porch light repaired, because Ethan Carter understood something that towns like Cedar Grove often forgot. Intimidation only worked if it changed behavior. And so the morning unfolded with the steady routine of someone refusing to acknowledge fear, his movements measured as he stepped onto the porch in the Navy working uniform, Type 3 AOR2, that had become almost second nature to his posture. The green digital camouflage blending easily with the forest line beyond the lake, his sandy blonde hair cropped short in strict military fashion, while a short beard framed the rugged lines of a face shaped by years of discipline and deployment. And beside him, Rex, the 5-year-old Belgian Malinois, whose fawn coat and dark mask gave him the alert, wolf-like presence typical of the breed, stretched slowly from where he had spent the night near the porch steps, muscles rippling beneath his coat, while amber eyes tracked the quiet shoreline with calm intelligence. The matte black tactical harness still fitted close to his body, as if readiness itself had become a permanent condition. Ethan's decision to spend the morning at the Cedar Grove Marina came not from necessity, but from strategy, because small towns always watched outsiders more closely than locals, and a man standing around asking questions drew attention faster than a man working, and so by mid-morning he was hauling crates beside the docks with the rest of the laborers who serviced the fishing boats and tourist charters, the air thick with the smell of diesel fuel and lake water, while gulls circled overhead and wooden masts creaked against their lines. And among the dockhands moved people who had known each other for years, yet rarely spoke about the quiet tension spreading through Cedar Grove, including a broad-shouldered man named Carl Medina, who operated the marina crane, a 45-year-old mechanic, with weather-darkened skin and a gray streak through his beard from an old welding accident, a practical man whose loyalty ran toward whoever paid fairly and left him alone. And while Carl barely looked twice at Ethan, he did notice Rex lying calmly beside the dock piling, the dog's gaze moving steadily from boat to truck with the patience of an animal trained to observe without drawing attention. Throughout the morning, Ethan worked without rushing, lifting boxes, tying ropes, helping guide a charter boat toward its slip, while quietly memorizing the rhythm of vehicles entering and leaving the marina parking lot. And by noon, he had already noticed something that would have seemed ordinary to most people, but stood out clearly to someone trained to detect patterns. 2 dark cargo trucks arriving from the North Road and parking briefly near the older storage sheds before leaving again without loading fishing supplies or fuel, trucks that carried no company markings and whose drivers rarely stepped out long enough to be recognized. And Rex noticed them too, the dog's ears lifting each time the engines rolled past before settling again once the vehicles disappeared along the shoreline. Road. That afternoon, Ethan finished his shift with the same calm anonymity he had maintained all day, collecting his modest pay envelope from a narrow-shouldered harbor clerk named Douglas Pike, a thin, nervous man in his early 50s who wore thick glasses and spoke with the careful politeness of someone who preferred paperwork to confrontation. And Pike barely glanced up from his ledger as Ethan signed the receipt, because the marina office had become accustomed to seasonal workers drifting through Cedar Grove each year. Yet outside on the dock, Rex rose immediately when Ethan stepped into the open air, the Malinois falling into position beside him with effortless discipline as they walked toward the pickup truck parked near the boat ramp. Night came slowly over Cedar Lake, the sky turning deep blue behind the silhouette of pine trees, while the water darkened to a flat mirror broken only by the distant hum of outboard motors returning to shore. And Ethan waited until the marina lights had dimmed before guiding the truck along the narrow forest road that curved toward the north side of the lake, where older docks had once served logging barges decades earlier. A place rarely visited now except by fishermen who preferred quiet waters, and Rex sat upright beside him inside the cab, head tilted slightly as the dog tracked scents drifting through the open window, the cool air carrying traces of engine oil and unfamiliar rubber long before the vehicles themselves appeared. They stopped near a stand of tall cedar trees overlooking the northern dock, the truck hidden beneath branches, while Ethan moved carefully through the brush with Rex at his side, the dog's steps nearly silent despite the harness resting across his shoulders, and from their position above the dock, they could see two cargo trucks reversing slowly toward the wooden platform where several men stood waiting beside stacked crates that looked too small for fishing equipment and too carefully wrapped for ordinary deliveries. And Ethan raised a compact camera fitted with a long lens, the motion smooth and deliberate as he began recording the scene, while Rex remained perfectly still beside him, amber eyes locked onto the activity below without a single bark or movement that might reveal their position. The men unloading the trucks worked quickly, passing small metal cases and sealed envelopes between them before one of the drivers opened a crate long enough for Ethan to glimpse rows of thick folders stacked inside. Documents bound with rubber bands and stamped with legal seals that looked suspiciously official for cargo arriving at a forgotten dock after dark. And though Ethan could not hear every word carried by the wind, he recognized the language of bribery in the body language alone. Brief nods, envelopes sliding into coat pockets, the careful exchange of something too valuable to record openly. And when one man turned toward the light, Ethan's camera captured his face clearly enough to identify him as Harold Klein, a regional land broker known around Cedar Grove for arranging property. Sales connected to Caldwell Development, a lean, middle-aged man with slick gray hair and a habit of smiling politely, even while negotiating aggressively for land that did not belong to him. The trucks left within 15 minutes, engines rumbling back onto the road, while Ethan continued filming long enough to capture their license plates before lowering the camera and retreating into the forest with Rex moving silently beside him, the dog glancing once toward the empty dock as if committing the scene to memory, before turning away with the same disciplined calm he had shown throughout the operation. And by the time they reached the truck, the night wind had begun rising again across the lake, carrying the quiet sense that Cedar Grove's surface calm hid something far more complicated beneath. Across town, the lights in the Cedar Grove Gazette office still burned long past closing time, where Jack Turner sat hunched over a cluttered desk surrounded by maps, contracts, and property records spread across the room like pieces of a puzzle no one else seemed interested in solving. And Jack Turner looked exactly like the sort of investigative reporter who found himself working in small towns rather than large newspapers. Thin build, slightly rumpled shirt sleeves, dark hair falling across his forehead, while wire-frame glasses slid constantly down his nose. But his sharp blue eyes carried the restless curiosity that had driven him into journalism after his father lost a ranch in Wyoming during a fraudulent land deal years earlier, a family event that had hardened Jack's quiet. Determination to expose corruption whenever he saw it, even if the story only reached a few thousand readers. Emily Harper sat across from him on the edge of the desk, still wearing her diner jacket, while the faint smell of coffee followed her into the office. And between them lay a stack of property contracts Jack had obtained through public records requests, each document marked with the same legal firm representing Caldwell Development. And as Jack flipped through the papers, he explained what he had discovered over the past months. Several Cedar Grove residents pressured into selling lakefront land at prices far below market value. Signatures that appeared on contracts only days after confrontations, similar to the one Emily had witnessed in the diner. And most troubling of all, a series of unexplained administrative fees paid through county channels that led directly to accounts connected with Sheriff Daniel Brooks. Emily listened carefully, her expression tightening as the pieces formed a picture larger than a single violent encounter. And when Jack finished outlining the pattern, she hesitated before telling him about the man who had walked into the diner that morning with the military uniform and the quiet confidence that seemed to change the entire room. And Jack leaned back slowly as recognition flickered across his face, because earlier that afternoon he had already heard from one of the marina workers about a new laborer hauling crates beside the docks, while a Belgian Malinois waited calmly nearby, a description unusual enough to stay in his mind. The realization settled quietly between them then, that somewhere along Cedar Lake another investigation had already begun, one carried out not with documents and public records, but with the patience of someone trained to watch before acting. And when Jack finally stood and pulled on his jacket, he told Emily he intended to visit the marina in the morning to see whether the man she described might be following the same trail of evidence he had been uncovering. Because if that was true, then Cedar Grove's long silence might finally be facing someone unwilling to accept it. Miles away along the northern shoreline, Ethan Carter drove slowly back toward the Carter house with Rex resting calmly in the passenger seat. The camera beside him filled with images of trucks, envelopes, and license plates that tied the night's activity directly to Caldwell Development, and though the lake looked peaceful under the moonlight, he understood clearly now that the slap inside Cedar Grove Diner had only been the surface ripple of a much deeper current, one that connected intimidation, land deals, and local authority in ways the town had learned not to question. Dawn over Cedar Lake arrived slowly that morning, the pale light spreading across the water like a thin sheet of glass, while fog lifted from the shoreline and the pine ridges above Cedar Grove softened into quiet silhouettes. And from the Carter house, the lake looked calm enough to hide every secret it carried beneath the surface. Yet inside the modest cedar kitchen, Ethan Carter had already been awake for hours, sitting at the table where the night's footage played across the small laptop screen, while Rex lay beside the chair with the steady patience of a K-9 who had long ago learned that important moments often began in silence. Ethan's posture remained relaxed but alert, shoulders squared beneath the familiar Navy working uniform type 3AOR2 that had become as natural to him as breathing. The green digital camouflage faintly catching the soft morning light, while his hazel eyes studied the images, frame by frame, the trucks at the northern dock, the envelopes passed between hands, the clear view of license plates and faces that connected Caldwell Development to the quiet bribery surrounding Cedar Lake. And when he finished reviewing the final clip, he copied every file onto an encrypted drive before opening a secure communications portal that had once been provided to him through military intelligence channels during an overseas assignment, the sort of quiet digital doorway that connected people like him to federal agencies who knew how to listen when local authorities could no longer be trusted. The files transferred slowly across the signal while Rex lifted his head slightly, ears turning toward the open window as if the dog could sense the invisible movement of information leaving the room. And though Rex was only 5 years old, his experience working beside Ethan had sharpened instincts beyond those of ordinary animals. The Belgian Malinois, carrying the lean athletic build of his breed, fawn coat and black facial mask, catching the light whenever he shifted position, while the matty black tactical harness remained fitted across his chest even indoors. Because Rex had long ago learned that readiness rarely came with warning. When the transfer completed, Ethan typed a short message addressed to the FBI Land Corruption Task Force, attaching the files along with a concise summary of what the footage revealed. And he knew the unit well enough to understand that men and women working inside it did not ignore evidence involving land fraud, bribery, and potential federal conspiracy, especially when it crossed state lines the way Caldwell Development's operations clearly did. Across town, the Cedar Grove Gazette office remained cluttered with the same stacks of records Jack Turner had been analyzing for weeks, and Jack himself looked as though sleep had become optional rather than necessary. His thin frame bent slightly over the desk while morning sunlight filtered through dusty blinds onto maps of Cedar Lake pinned to the wall behind him, each property line marked carefully in red ink where suspicious sales had occurred. Jack Turner was 32 years old, but carried the restless energy of someone who had lived several careers already. Dark hair falling over his forehead in constant defiance of the comb, while wire-framed glasses rested halfway down his nose. And though his appearance suggested a man more comfortable with books than conflict, his stubborn integrity had been shaped years earlier when his father lost the family ranch in Wyoming through a fraudulent land scheme that local authorities never bothered to investigate. That memory had followed Jack into journalism, turning him into the kind of reporter who chased quiet corruption rather than loud headlines. And when he checked his email that morning, the anonymous message containing federal contact references and corroborating footage from the lake docks confirmed something he had begun to suspect. The man Emily Harper had described inside the diner was already moving deeper into the same investigation Jack had been building piece by piece. Back at the Carter house, Helen Carter moved carefully through the kitchen while Ethan prepared coffee, the elderly woman calmer now, though the faint mark on her cheek had not fully faded, her silver hair tied neatly as always while she watched her son with the quiet pride of someone who understood that courage sometimes arrived wearing patience rather than anger. Outside, the lake breeze stirred the pine branches gently, yet Rex's head lifted again toward the forest road as the dog caught a distant scent riding the wind, the muscles along his shoulders tightening almost imperceptibly beneath the harness before settling again once the sound of tires faded, and Ethan noticed the reaction without comment because he trusted the dog's instincts more than any alarm system money could buy. Night returned colder than the previous evening, the moon rising pale above Cedar Lake, while the Carter house sat in a pocket of shadow near the waterline. And though Ethan appeared relaxed inside the living room, his awareness had already expanded beyond the walls, every faint movement outside measured and catalogued in the quiet rhythm of a man who had spent years waiting for trouble to arrive. Rex lay near the front door at first, body stretched across the wooden floor with eyes half closed. But when the distant crunch of gravel reached the porch steps, the Malinois rose instantly, ears forward and body still as stone, while a low vibration formed deep in his chest, not a bark, but the early warning of a working dog preparing to defend. Outside in the darkness, Logan Briggs crouched beside the porch railing with 3 men positioned behind him along the tree line, their figures barely visible beneath the thin light of the moon. Logan looked different from the swaggering bully who had stood inside the diner days earlier, though the heavy build and rough stubble remained unchanged, his thick jacket pulled tight against the cold, while his eyes flicked constantly toward the house windows, as if calculating risk with every breath. The men beside him had been hired through Caldwell's construction contractors, ordinary muscle rather than professional criminals, including a tall, narrow-faced man named Victor Kane, whose restless movements revealed the nerves of someone unused to night work, and a stocky mechanic called Randall Pierce, whose beard and oil-stained hands marked him as a man more comfortable repairing engines than threatening homeowners. Yet the promise of quick money had convinced them to join Logan's plan to recover whatever evidence Ethan Carter might have collected. Rex sensed them long before their boots touched the porch steps, the Malinois shifting position with fluid precision while Ethan moved quietly toward the door, opening it just enough to step outside into the cold air where the lake wind carried the scent of unfamiliar men through the trees. Logan straightened the moment Ethan appeared, his expression tightening when he noticed the absence of fear in the man standing before him. And though Logan had brought a pistol tucked into his waistband, he hesitated now under the steady gaze of both Ethan and the silent dog beside him, because Rex had stepped forward slightly, with muscles coiled beneath the harness, amber eyes fixed on Logan's hands with the focused attention of a trained canine reading every motion. "Evening visit," Logan muttered, trying to regain the confidence that had served him inside Cedar Grove for years. Yet Ethan did not respond with anger or threats. He only walked a few steps away from the porch, so the confrontation unfolded in the open yard beneath the moonlight, creating distance between the house and whatever violence Logan had intended to bring. The tension lasted only seconds before Logan lunged forward with the desperation of someone who realized control was slipping away. Yet Ethan moved faster, his training converting instinct into action as he redirected the larger man's momentum and forced him to the ground with a controlled movement that left Logan pinned in the gravel while the hired men behind him froze uncertainly, their courage evaporating under the silent pressure of Rex standing ready beside Ethan. No gun fired that night, no shout echoed across the lake, because Ethan kept the encounter contained with the calm authority of someone who understood exactly how much force was necessary, and no more. And when Logan finally stopped struggling, the sound of distant engines approaching along the road reached them all, headlights cutting through the trees as multiple vehicles rolled toward the Carter property with deliberate speed. Morning broke over Cedar Grove under the low rumble of federal SUVs entering town, the dark vehicles moving quietly along Main Street before turning toward the lakeshore, where uniformed agents stepped out with the efficient coordination of professionals accustomed to arrest operations, and among them walked Special Agent Laura Mitchell of the FBI Land Corruption Task Force, a tall woman in her early 40s whose calm expression concealed years spent dismantling financial crime networks across the western states. Her dark hair pulled into a practical knot, while sharp gray eyes surveyed the Carter property with the analytical precision of someone already familiar with every piece of evidence Ethan had sent overnight. Within the hour, Sheriff Daniel Brooks stood on his own front porch, staring at the warrant in Agent Mitchell's hand, while deputies from neighboring counties watched silently behind her. the tired lawman's shoulders sagging beneath the weight of accusations he could no longer dismiss. And across town, Logan Briggs sat handcuffed beside a patrol vehicle, while the same agents escorted Richard Caldwell, the polished investor whose expensive coat and confident smile had once convinced Cedar Grove that prosperity was coming, to another waiting SUV. Caldwell looked nothing like the triumphant developer he had pretended to be during town meetings, his neatly combed silver hair disheveled now as the realization settled that the network of bribery and intimidation he had built around Cedar Lake had finally surfaced into the open where federal law replaced small-town silence. Morning returned to Cedar Grove with a kind of quiet the town had almost forgotten existed. Not the tense silence that had settled over streets during the years when people kept their heads down and their voices low, but the slower, steadier quiet that followed the end of a storm. And as the pale spring sun rose over Cedar Lake, the town began waking with cautious curiosity rather than fear. Pickup trucks rolling down Main Street while doors opened earlier than usual, and people stood longer on their porches, watching the water and the hills beyond it, as if confirming that the world had not changed overnight, but the weight pressing on it somehow had. News of the federal arrests had spread faster than the morning light itself, moving through Cedar Grove like wind through the pines, carried from house to house by phone calls and kitchen conversations, and the simple relief of neighbors realizing they no longer needed to whisper about Logan Briggs or the money surrounding Caldwell development. By the time the sun reached the diner windows, the town had begun stepping cautiously back into its own daylight. And inside Cedar Grove Diner, the air carried a different rhythm than it had only days earlier. The diner looked the same as it always had, red trim peeling slightly near the door, the smell of coffee and frying bacon settling into the old wooden counters. But something inside it had shifted in a way that furniture and paint could never explain, because the room no longer held the invisible tension that had once pressed down on every conversation. Emily Harper stood behind the counter that morning with a calm confidence she had never fully allowed herself before. The 26-year-old woman moving through the familiar routine of pouring coffee and sliding plates across the counter, while sunlight caught the freckles across her cheeks and the auburn strands of hair that had slipped loose from her ponytail. Emily had always been kind with customers, always patient even when exhaustion sat behind her eyes. Yet the months of intimidation surrounding Caldwell's project had forced her into a smaller version of herself, a quieter person who measured every word before speaking. Now that tension had begun to dissolve, replaced by the steady determination of someone who had watched fear lose its hold over the town. And though she still wore the same faded diner apron, the way she stood behind the counter carried a new certainty that her voice, and the voices of others in Cedar Grove, could no longer be ignored. The owner of Cedar Grove Diner, Martha Collins, had called Emily early that morning with unexpected news that had spread quickly among the regulars seated at the counter. Martha Collins was a broad-shouldered woman in her late 60s whose silver hair had been tied in the same bun for nearly 30 years behind the grill, a practical, strong-willed person who had once run the diner beside her late husband before arthritis forced her to step back from daily work. Martha had always trusted Emily's judgment and kindness, and after watching the young woman stand firm during the confrontation with Logan Briggs, she had quietly decided something needed to change. By the time breakfast ended that morning, Martha had announced that Emily Harper would officially take over as manager of the diner, a decision greeted with nods of approval from the customers who had known Emily since she was a teenager pouring coffee after school. Emily accepted the responsibility with a mixture of surprise and quiet pride, aware that this small shift represented more than a job promotion. It meant Cedar Grove itself had begun choosing courage over silence. Across town, the Cedar Grove Gazette office buzzed with the controlled chaos that accompanied a story finally reaching the surface after months of quiet investigation. Jack Turner sat at his cluttered desk, surrounded by the documents he had spent weeks collecting, property records and contract copies, now joined by official arrest statements released by federal agents earlier that morning. Jack looked as though he had barely slept, his dark hair pushed back from his forehead while his glasses rested crookedly against the bridge of his nose. But the tiredness in his posture could not hide the satisfaction in his eyes as he finished typing the final lines of the article that would appear in the afternoon edition. For Jack, this story had always been more than professional curiosity. It was the culmination of a promise he had made to himself years earlier after watching corruption steal his family's land in Wyoming. His investigation had begun with scattered records and suspicious sales around Cedar Lake, yet now the evidence connected everything together. Logan Briggs intimidating property owners, Sheriff Daniel Brooks quietly accepting payments in exchange for ignoring complaints, and Richard Caldwell orchestrating the entire network from behind the polished image of a development company promising prosperity. Jack reread the headline once before sending the story to print, knowing that by sunset, the entire county would understand exactly what had been happening beneath the calm surface of Cedar Grove. That afternoon, the town hall filled more quickly than it had in years, residents gathering beneath the tall wooden ceiling where community meetings were usually sparsely attended. The building itself carried the worn dignity of something built when towns expected their citizens to speak openly, and the long benches creaked under the weight of farmers, shopkeepers, fishermen, and families who had once avoided public gatherings during Caldwell's rise to influence. At the front of the room stood several federal agents overseeing the proceedings, their presence calm but unmistakable, and among them waited Special Agent Laura Mitchell, whose sharp gray eyes moved steadily across the crowd while she coordinated the legal formalities surrounding the arrests. When Logan Briggs was brought forward under escort, the murmurs inside the room faded into a deep quiet that felt very different from the silence Cedar Grove had known before. Logan looked smaller now than he had inside the diner weeks earlier, the heavy confidence that once shaped his posture replaced by the rigid tension of someone forced to confront the consequences of his actions. His broad frame remained the same, shoulders thick beneath the plain jacket provided by the detention officers. Yet the arrogance in his expression had faded, leaving only a tired frustration that seemed to settle into the rough lines of his face. Agent Mitchell informed the crowd that as part of the federal investigation, Logan Briggs had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors regarding the corruption network surrounding Cedar Lake, and part of that cooperation involved acknowledging the intimidation tactics he had used against residents of Cedar Grove. The room remained quiet as Logan turned slowly toward Helen Carter, who sat in the second row beside her son, her posture as composed as ever, despite the attention now focused upon her. Helen Carter looked much as she always had, small, silver-haired, dressed neatly in the same practical style she had carried for decades. Yet the calm in her blue eyes now carried a deeper strength, the quiet confidence of someone who had refused to surrender her dignity even when confronted with humiliation. Logan's voice came out rougher than expected when he spoke, the words clearly difficult for a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered. Yet he managed to apologize for striking her in the diner and for the intimidation he had used against others in the town. The apology did not erase the past, nor did it undo the fear his actions had created. But hearing those words spoken publicly inside the town hall marked a moment Cedar Grove had long needed, a clear acknowledgement that silence had ended. Outside the meeting, the streets felt lighter, conversations flowing more easily as people stepped into the open air beneath the afternoon sky. Children rode bicycles past storefronts that had once seemed permanently subdued, and fishermen gathered near the marina discussing the changes already unfolding across the lakefront properties, now freed from Caldwell's influence. Cedar Grove had not transformed overnight into something entirely new, yet the sense of caution that once shaped every interaction had begun giving way to something healthier, a cautious optimism that the town might finally return to the quieter rhythm it had known before corruption settled over it. By evening, Ethan Carter stood on the narrow wooden dock behind the Carter house, watching the lake settle into the calm glow of sunset, the surface reflecting bands of orange and gold beneath the fading sky, while the surrounding pine forests darkened slowly against the horizon. Rex lay stretched comfortably beside Helen Carter near the end of the dock, the Belgian Malinois resting with his head lowered between his paws, while the gentle lake breeze stirred the fawn fur along his shoulders, the tactical harness still visible, though the tension that once accompanied it had eased into the relaxed posture of a dog who understood that for now the watch was quiet. Helen rested one hand gently along Rex's back while gazing out across the water, her face peaceful in a way Ethan had not seen since before the troubles began. Ethan himself stood a few steps behind them, tall and still in the familiar NWU Type 3 AOR-2 uniform that had defined so much of his life. his hazel eyes moving slowly across the lake and the distant shoreline of Cedar Grove, where lights began appearing in windows as evening settled over the town. Orders would eventually call him back to service. That much he understood as clearly as the lake before him. Yet the knowledge that Cedar Grove had found its voice again brought a quiet satisfaction that required no celebration. The town had not been saved by force alone, but by the simple refusal of ordinary people to remain silent once the truth surfaced. As the final light faded from the water, Rex lifted his head briefly and looked toward Ethan before settling again beside Helen, the dog's calm presence anchoring the quiet moment. And across the lake, the small town of Cedar Grove continued its slow return to life, the echoes of fear fading into memory, while conversations carried freely through open windows and along the docks. The lake lay still beneath the evening sky, reflecting the last colors of sunset, as if sealing the promise that the silence which once protected corruption had finally been broken. And in the peaceful glow of that quiet shoreline, Cedar Grove began at last to breathe again. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or blazing light across the sky. Sometimes they begin quietly in ordinary places, in a small-town diner, in the courage of a mother who refuses to surrender what is right, in the loyalty of a dog who stands watch beside his partner, and in the calm strength of someone who chooses truth instead of fear. Stories like this remind us that God often works through everyday people. He gives courage to the ones who stand up when others stay silent, wisdom to those who seek justice, and strength to those who protect the weak. In our daily lives, we may not face criminals or corruption like the people of Cedar Grove, but every day we are given moments where we can choose kindness instead of indifference, truth instead of silence, and courage instead of fear. That is where real miracles begin. They begin when ordinary people decide to do the right thing, even when it is difficult. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that goodness still matters in this world, share this video with someone who needs a little hope today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what part of the story moved you the most. And if you believe that courage and faith can still change lives, write amen in the comments so others who read it will know they are not alone. Do not forget to subscribe to this channel so more stories of faith, courage, loyalty, and quiet miracles can reach people who may be waiting for a sign. May God watch over you, protect your family, guide your steps, and bring peace to your home wherever you're watching from today. Amen.